Hello, this is the National Council for Preservation Education's third webinar titled An Introduction to the National Park Service's Technical Preservation Services, Heritage Documentation Programs, and Historic Preservation Training Center, and to the General Services Administration Center for Historic Buildings. This is an orientation and educational series for interns and others new to or interested in the Federal Historic Preservation Program. It's offered in collaboration with the National Park Service's Cultural Resources, Partnerships, and Science Directorate in Washington, D.C. I'm Julie Johnson, the co-director of the National Council's Internship Program. I'm joined today by the director of the program, Michael Tomlin, of NCPE's Executive Committee. Michael will help me monitor the Q&A. I want to welcome all the NCPE interns, other interns, fellows, staff, and volunteers participating in today's webinar. I'm delighted you can participate and look forward to your questions and comments. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to give you a brief introduction to the National Council for Preservation Education and mention our conference scheduled for later this year. NCPE is a nonprofit national organization whose members are educational institutions that offer degrees in historic preservation, heritage conservation, and cultural resource management. There are 64 institutional members from universities and colleges and training centers from all over the United States. Part of NCPE's mission is to facilitate the collection and dissemination of information and ideas concerning historic preservation and historic preservation education. To that end, NCPE sponsors an annual conference, usually held in conjunction with the National Trusts, but virtual in 2020. The theme this year is Development, Respecting History While Acknowledging Change, and it will take place on October 26th. The conference keynote speaker is Rachel Weber, a professor in the Urban Planning and Policy Department at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She's the author of From Boom to Bubble, How Finance Built the New Chicago, among other publications. For those of you who are interested in the role of money in building and overbuilding our cities, and that should be all of us, this will be a fascinating and informative presentation. There will be other speakers on this topic as well. I invite you to visit NCPE's website to learn more, including how to participate for free. The URL is ncpe.us/conference/. It still has pre-COVID-19 information on it, but will be updated soon. Since 2008, NCPE has published a peer-reviewed journal called Preservation Education and Research, PER. We will publish some of the papers from the conference, but the editor is also looking for submissions for next year. I mention it since, one, the first 9 volumes are online at NCPE's website and provides excellent reading on a variety of topics in the field, and 2, I want to encourage submissions from interns. The projects you're working on and research you're doing could be of interest to the larger preservation community. If you want to take your work a step further by getting published, take a look at the submission guidelines at ncpe.us/publications/. I'm honored to be joined today by Paloma Belasny, the Youth Programs Coordinator at NPS's Cultural Resources Office of Interpretation and Education in Washington, D.C. Paloma is responsible for assembling the speakers in this webinar series. Paloma, would you like to say a few words about yourself and today's webinar?
Sure. Thank you, Julie. Hi, everyone. My name is Paloma Belasny, and I'm the Youth Program Coordinator for the Cultural Resources Directorate in the Washington office of the National Park Service for the Cultural Resources Directorate. I want to welcome everybody. As Julie said, everyone is welcome to this webinar. NCPE is hosting it, but we want to make sure that all our attendees feel welcome, and we appreciate you joining us. Today we're hearing from some additional programs within the National Park Service's Cultural Resources Directorate, And then we'll also hear from our colleagues at the General Services Administration. Thank you to all our panelists for taking the time to present today. We really appreciate it. And thank you, Julie, for orchestrating the webinar, moderating, and coordinating all the technology that goes into this. Thank you so much. Enjoy the webinar.
Well, thank you, Paloma, and I'm happy to do it. You'll see from the agenda that we have 4 speakers today. There will be time to answer questions after each speaker, so don't hesitate to put your questions in the Q&A or chat so I can relay them. I will also provide contact information for each of our speakers at the end of the webinar in case you want to ask a question in the future offline. We can also respond to more questions at the end, time permitting. I want to introduce our first speaker. For the last 20 years, Angela Shearer has been an architectural historian with Technical Preservation Services Division, where she reviews rehabilitation projects in 12 states for the Federal Historic Tax Incentives Program and provides technical assistance to the public on how to preserve and protect historic properties. This is her second day on the job in a new role as a supervisory historian with the program. Are you ready to go, Angela?
TPS is part of the Washington, D.C. Office of the National Park Service that is responsible not only for the administration of the Federal Tax Incentives Program, but is also charged with developing standards and guidelines for the treatment of historic properties, primarily through publications such as our Preservation Brief Series, Tech Notes, and other pamphlets, some of which you may be familiar with. We also organize workshops and conferences dealing with various preservation topics. I'm going to go over each of these items today briefly. First of all, we're the keepers of the Secretary of Interior standards and the accompanying guidelines. The Secretary of Interior standards are the central document of historic preservation philosophy and practice in the United States. The standards were first developed in 1975, and there are standards for 4 distinct but interrelated approaches to the treatment of historic properties: preservation, restoration, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. It is recommended that when undertaking work to a historic property, one of these treatment standards is undertaken, and I will briefly go over each of these treatments. Preservation focuses on the maintenance and repair of existing historic materials and retention of a property's form as it evolved over time. In this example, Drayton Hall in Charleston, South Carolina was built in 1738, and it's virtually unchanged since its construction. Rehabilitation acknowledges the need to alter or add to a historic property to meet continuing or changing uses while retaining the property's historic character. This mill in Oella, Maryland, was rehabilitated for a new use as residential apartments. The historic industrial character was retained, even though it now serves a very different purpose. Exposed brick walls, historic ceilings, and floors are examples of how the industrial character was maintained. The rehabilitation standards are the most commonly used, including for the federal tax incentives projects. Restoration depicts a property at a particular period of time in its history while removing evidence of other periods. In this example, the home of James Madison was constructed in 1723. It was substantially enlarged by the DuPont family in 1901, which is the upper right-hand photo. In 2003, the Montpelier Foundation and the National Trust for Historic Preservation decided to take it back to Madison's period of significance. All DuPont era changes were reversed, and it now appears as it did during Madison's time in the lower right-hand photo. Reconstruction recreates vanished or non-surviving portion of a property for interpretive purposes. The Governor's Palace in Williamsburg, Virginia, illustrated here, was originally constructed in 1721, but it burned in 1781. It was rebuilt in 1934 according to historic plans and archaeological evidence. And it's important to keep in mind that reconstruction must be based on historic documentation. The intent of the standards is to assist the long-term preservation of a property's significance through the preservation of historic materials and features. The standards can be used by anyone planning or undertaking work on historic properties. They are required in regulation in several instances, including grant and aid projects, tax credit projects both for state and federal tax credits, federal agency historic preservation activities, and state and local review of rehabilitation proposals. They are also adopted by historic district and planning commissions all over the United States, such as the Montgomery County Historic Preservation Commission. Our office is the keeper of the standards, but if you were to read the standards, they really are just 10 sort of simple sentences and principles. In order to help interpret the standards, we publish guidelines that help interpret them. And this is a publication available on our website. And a sample page from these guidelines where it provides recommended and not recommended treatment examples. And this is really useful for anybody who is undertaking work to a historic building, just providing best practices. There are also guidelines on sustainability and cultural resources, and most recently we published guidelines on flood adaptation for rehabilitating historic buildings. The illustrated version of these is due to be published later this year. Another thing I mentioned that our office does is we have a large publication program as well as conduct training activities to help people undertake treatments of historic buildings. We have over 150 titles currently in print. The most well-known of our publications are the Preservation Briefs. Preservation Brief 1 first appeared in 1975, and I must say we've been writing ever since. The series now totals 50, with several more in progress and some being updated. These briefs cover topics such as masonry repair, cleaning of historic buildings, repair of wood and steel windows, preservation of historic concrete, preservation of historic signs, repair and preservation of stained and blooded glass, and conserving energy in historic buildings, to name a few. The text of every preservation brief is available on our website. We also have several other series, including tech notes and a series called First Time Users Guides for federal tax credits based on building types such as barns and commercial buildings. So all of our publications are available online. TPS has also developed and presented leading national conferences reaching thousands of key decision makers and technical experts involved in the preservation and rehabilitation of historic buildings and other properties. Topics in the past have included windows, roofing, interiors, building codes, preserving the recent past, and historic properties related to recreation. Moreover, TPS provides additional training to the public by participation with other preservation partners in national meetings, such as the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Technical Preservation Services also provides education training opportunities through our web. We've created many web-based trainings, and throughout the year we also try to host webinars. The last topic I wanted to share is the federal tax incentives program. The program was started in 1976 when Congress created the program to promote preservation and community revitalization. Prior to this, the federal tax code actually worked in favor of demolition and new construction and against the preservation of historic buildings. So an effort was made to redress this imbalance. Over the years, the program has changed slightly, such as the amount of credit offered, but the basics remain the same. Some basics about the program. The tax credit is a dollar-for-dollar reduction in the amount of taxes you owe. It is not a deduction. The owners eligible for a credit up to 20% of qualifying rehabilitation costs for the project. For example, a $10 million project of a factory to housing, you would get $2 million in tax credits, which is again lowering the taxes you owe. The project must be substantial, and the building must be historic, such as being listed in the National Register of Historic Places. The credit can also be used with other types of credits, such as affordable housing or other state historic tax credits. It is important that all work must meet the standards for rehabilitation, and that is what we in our office do, is we're reviewing that work, that it meets the standards. Since its creation, the tax incentives have spurred the rehabilitation of historic structures everywhere, almost every period, size, and style. It has been very successful in the last 40 years. To date, over 45,000 properties have been rehabilitated under this program, equaling over $102 billion in investment. In fiscal year 2019, it is estimated that over 1,042 projects equaling over $5 billion in investment were rehabilitated. The program has many benefits. It promotes investment in older neighborhoods. It increases state and local real estate taxes. It creates jobs, stimulates other rehabilitation, and attracts new residents. This is just one example of a very small project. It was only $14,000, where the major work was just to update their HVAC systems. And yet we see very large projects as well. The Fontainebleau Resort Hotel in Miami Beach, 1954 modern hotel, rehabilitated for continuing use. One of the things I enjoy about my job is just seeing building transformations. The upper left picture is a historic photograph, and prior to rehabilitation, on the lower picture, you see that there's a big covering of the front facade. And as part of the rehabilitation, that was removed, and the building looks very much like it did historically for a continued commercial use. One of the things we also have to work closely with is working with codes and finding technical solutions to maintain a building's historic character and materials. This is a creative way to retain the original multi-light classroom doors in a former school while providing a required fire separation. The new door has been installed behind the multi-light historic door, and when residents open the solid door in their units, the original door acts as a screen door. Our website can help owners and applicants rehabilitate a historic project, whether you're undertaking a special program or just trying to look for best practices. It includes information about the tax incentives program, instructions, and downloadable forms, as well as a tremendous amount of technical guidance that can help solve specific rehabilitation problems. And I would just like to close in letting you know that you are welcome to reach out to me anytime during or after your internship if you have further questions about the work we do that don't get answered today. So I hope I have enough time for questions.
I'm going to remember to unmute myself before asking a question. One of, I think we answered Peter's question. Laura does have a question for you about the tax credit applying to buildings owned by nonprofit organizations. Do you want to provide her with a little bit of detail about how nonprofit organizations can partner in order to take advantage of the tax credit?
That is a very complicated question, and you have to remember, I'm trained as a historian, And this program is administered, or I should say it's co-administered between the National Park Service and the Internal Revenue Service. So what you're really asking is kind of more of an IRS side of the pot. And if you would look on our website, we do provide a little bit of information about that, because technically nonprofits, you know, don't collect taxes. So they have to form a special sort of partnership structure in order to utilize that. So it's not an easy thing to answer as far as, I think, in this session here, but I've seen that it has been done, but it does take a special like tax attorney to sort of help someone guide or answer those questions, because the program, like I said, it is a tax credit. So all of our certification decisions are going to the IRS, and they audit and handle that aspect of the program. But if you look on our website, we have a IRS section. And if you want to reach out to me, I'll be happy to send you the link for that.
Thank you, Angela. Yes, also at the IRS website, there's more information about forming partnerships, limited partnerships, and syndicating in order to take advantage and sell the tax credit on behalf of the nonprofit organization, so they get the benefit from it. Let's see, I think here's this one from Jade. Do the guidelines/standards provide guidance about balancing compliance with current building codes and ADA accessibility while maintaining a property's historic character? So what kind of balancing act do the guidelines demonstrate that would help in the user making decisions about best practices?
I think the guidelines, and they were reissued, I think, in 2017, provide some just general recommended and not recommended approaches in consideration for the buildings. We also have an accessibility preservation brief that outlines a thought process and some recommendations. I think a lot of times what's helpful to see is just examples of how other buildings approach that. And we also say every single building is very different and unique. So when I think about a building, is it a building on Main Street, or is it a house? There's so many building types, and sometimes it's very easy to incorporate it. Sometimes buildings now have been built with ADA in mind. So we're dealing with a range of buildings, but I think those are good starting points. And then if there are further questions, you know, we certainly try and work through that. We understand buildings need to be brought up to code. So we say, the regulations actually say for tax credits, you know, the standards take precedence, but at the same time, we work in a world, we have to deal with the technical feasibility possible too. And technical feasibility is always changing and improving as new technologies change. So something that worked in the 70s was great at that time, but now we have so much new technology. We just have to always adapt and evolve with that.
We have another question. Anonymous asks, Aloha, how is it decided what kind of change a building will undergo? Who decides whether it would be better for a site to undergo rehabilitation or preservation? Is it usually obvious from the condition of the site?
I think that's up to the owner. For the federal rehabilitation tax credit, we are using the standards for rehabilitation. In some ways, repairing and replacing might seem restorative, and we use terms like restoration and sort of interchangeably sometimes. I just wanted to make sure that everyone understood there is a distinction, but it's up to the, unless it's a federal agency, but it's up to the applicant, or it's up to the owner of the property to make that determination.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions, but I know that tax credits usually provoke a lot of questions, so hang around, Angela, just in case there are more at the end. I'm going to introduce my, oh, hold on, there's one last one from Peter. Can zoning play a role in that? Neighborhood, excuse me, can zoning play a role in that neighborhood designation as historical? Can zoning play a role in that? Neighborhoods designated as historical.
Not sure if I'm understanding the question perfectly, and so if I'm off topic, please reach out to me later. That's one of the disadvantages of doing it this way, but you might be referring to local historic commissions sometimes review properties, and they decide how to interpret rehabilitation. If we're going back to what is the best practice, if it's a preservation or a restoration, I guess zoning could, but that's it's more, that goes back to your local community.
Okay, yeah. Can zoning, can a neighborhood that's designated as historical dictate how a restoration project takes place? That might be more of a question for someone who sits on a historic commission, as opposed to at the federal level, which doesn't have an ownership role in the properties that are being reviewed, for example, by the tax credits.
I guess it's important just to point out the federal tax credit program is an optional program. If you choose to participate, here's the benefit and these are our rules. And some states have state tax credits, and again, some property owners might be eligible for a state tax credit. They have homeowner occupied kind of programs that, but the federal government wouldn't necessarily be involved with the local decisions.
Right. Understood. Okay, we're going to stop there, and I'm